think that we can't look at our lives as anymore. We're isolated individuals that are connected to the grid via power lines, that we really are in this together. We have to start thinking about how as a community we are going to survive, how we're going to get food and energy and fuel on a short-term basis, but also on the long-term basis.
On one hand, we're looking at sort of long-term trends, and then the other is, okay, what happens in the short terms in terms of what types of shocks could happen and how do we respond to those? So we've actually come up with a kind of mapping system looking at a range of climate shocks and also a range of energy shocks and showing, okay, this is how it'll unfold. First these smaller shocks and then these larger ones. And we're trying to figure out how do we actually use these shocks as catalysts for proactive responses as opposed to sort of reactive ones, which can often be counterproductive.
This is Peak Moment. We are living at a peak of human innovation, information, wealth, and health. But we're also at a peak of population and consumption, with rising temperatures and declining resources fueled by cheap oil and gas. Peak Moment Television, bringing you examples of positive responses to energy decline and climate change through local community action.
We're at day 2 of the ASPO conference, and I'm here with Quinn Bachman, who's the Outreach Director for Community Services, the folks that brought us the film The Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil. Megan, what are you finding sort of new or interesting here at the conference?
Well, this is a very interesting conference for me. This is my 3rd ASPO conference, ASPO-USA, and really it's a very grim future that we're being shown here through the data, particularly from Matt Simmons' presentation, which was just downright frightening.
What did you hear in Matt's conference? What did he have to say that really hit you?
Yeah, the combination of the financial crisis and not just huge spikes in fuel prices, but the possibility and probability of shortages in the imminent future. And I just went through a blackout in my community in Ohio.
You did?
And it was,
an energy blackout?
Yeah.
Really?
For several days. People are still without power in our area for over a week now.
So you got a taste of this.
Exactly. And the anxiety in the air and people's inability to know what to do after those first few days when it's a little exciting, when they start realizing that how dependent they are on energy and how they have nothing and no alternatives. And so I fear greatly when that happens to the whole mass of the country with these gasoline shortages that could happen in just a few months here.
Because what he's saying is our reserves are down here in the United States. And already there's gas shortages in the Southeast. We read about that. So people are already tasting that.
Absolutely, and how it really is not going to take that much to have a shortage. It just takes a few, the run on the bank that he described, people just topping off their tanks, companies topping off their tanks. So
and we're out.
Exactly.
And we don't have food in 5 days on the shelves, or a week, or whatever.
Exactly, and the panic that I saw in people just a few days into a blackout where we were very isolated and it was just a regional thing, applying that to the massive scale really makes me worry because people don't know what to do. They don't have a network of support in their community. They don't have people that they can rely on. They don't know their neighbors. I think they'll be forced to come together, but at the same time, people are going to be thinking every man for himself, every household for himself. Even in our communities, there were people that were stealing each other's electricity. So it's a big challenge.
Wow.
Yeah.
And of course, under stress, and people are desperate, they're
Absolutely.
not, the kindness is going to probably get very thin in some places.
Right, and that's the thing I'm not hearing at this conference. It's all technical options, how we can replace oil with other sources, but it's not about the relationships side, the cooperation that is going to have to come into play, the local communities coming together and determining what they can do and everyone helping each other, because that's the only way that we have enough resources is if we share them.
What I see, this is my first ASPO conference, and I hear, brilliant slides and charts. We have our scientists and our engineers and so on who are really studying this well. And in a way, it's just safe to keep studying it.
Absolutely.
But it's not, and even the kinds of solutions are mostly technical and policy,
right,
and what government can do and so on. And you're right. I didn't, except for Matt Simmons. It was like I haven't heard anything that said, "What are people going to do?"
Yeah, there's almost an intellectual detachment that I see here, that people are really, tracking things and really concerned mostly about what are the implications going to be and what are the numbers, but not as many people I think are actually letting it sink in. What is going to happen? What are people going to do? And what are the most vulnerable populations going to do? And how do we avoid the worst human suffering and pain that is going to be caused by this problem?
You got a chance to sort of get a taste of that when you worked on the film crew for the movie on the power of community. So you got to see, people some years after who had a similar thing happen when oil got snatched from Cuba, and they had to they didn't have a plan either, right? Just like we don't. How do you think we're going to do we might do if this happens for us, relative, what could we learn from them?
Well, what I think the peak oil movement needs to be able to do is what a small group of organic agronomists in Cuba did several years before the crisis hit them, and that is create a contingency plan for how they would essentially transform the entire agricultural system for low energy use, for organic, more sustainable system. I think the movement needs to look at putting together options and using our technical knowledge to not just keep tracking what's going to happen, what the problem is, but to really create a plan for a solution and to start implementing that plan.
Now, when you talk about a plan, do you mean like sort of a comprehensive energy plan for America? I mean, or do you mean a community by community plan for blackouts? What are you thinking?
I think that probably both of those are needed, but I think we cannot continue to focus on the problem. We have to get to responses and strategies, and they can't be these big pictures, someday we'll be green and sustainable, electric vehicles and all of these large scale. I mean, I think we need more of the survival strategies, more of the emergency measures. That's why we talk about things like what are the lowest cost options for them to retrofit their home so they don't freeze in the winter? How do they maybe close off the rest of their house and just keep one room, the warm room kind of concept? How do you get food supplies, emergency gardening and food storage and preparation measures? So we're kind of focusing more on that. Even if the crisis doesn't hit as bad as Matt Simmons is saying that it will, these are measures that are going to be critically important and are important for other reasons: terrorism, hurricanes, natural disasters. So,
well, whether it's gas shortages or natural gas or heating oil or power, any of our energy infrastructure or natural events, I think having that kind of sense of preparedness, what you could do for 2 weeks.
Right.
If you had to stay home, you couldn't get to work, and the telecommunications were down. We have to think about all of those things. The internet is down. How would you and your family make drinking water? What do you do with your sewage waste?
Exactly.
All of that.
So
in a sense, we're talking about right here, right now, if it's an emergency, preparations.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And the other thing that Cuba really taught us is that the power of community, that was the title of our film, because it took people coming together. They knew that they couldn't deal with it on a household by household or person by person basis. They could only do so by pooling their resources, coming together. And actually, in my community of Yellow Springs, we saw some of that. People were helping each other clear branches from their yards. There were ice cream socials almost every single block because ice cream was melting in their freezer, so everyone was sharing that. So
that's nice.
I think that we can't look at our lives as anymore. We're isolated individuals that are connected to the grid via power lines, that we really are in this together. We have to start thinking about how as a community we are going to survive, how we're going to get food and energy and fuel on a short-term basis, but also on the long-term basis.
In Cuba, how did they organize the people cooperating together? I mean, was the government saying, you on this block, you have to, was it coming from the top? Was it coming from just the grassroots?
It was really a grassroots effort. People point out that Cuba was a socialist country, so they have more of a sense of community. I think in the U.S. we also have a history of that, and we can get back to that. But yes, it was a very grassroots effort. People decided that they needed to take care of the people, the old woman on their block that didn't have any food in her fridge, or the mother with, children that didn't have any other sources that she could go to. So we need to create our own safety net, because as we're seeing with what's happening with the debt crisis, with the housing crisis, we can't trust the government to look out for people anymore. We have to take care of ourselves.
That's the Katrina lesson. That's what I figure is lessons. You can't count the government. One last question here. Has your community, has anybody begun talking about, let's learn from this blackout and do some teaching of one another, survival skills, tools, preparations? Anybody starting to talk about how to take care of yourselves for the next round?
Oh, absolutely. And especially at Community Solutions, we're looking at turning our garage into a canning facility that we can offer to the neighborhood to use, and to also store food, because if the blackout continued for a few more weeks, and of course, as Matt Simmons pointed out, it really will only take a couple of weeks for the stores' shelves to be completely empty because of the just-in-time delivery system. We're going to have to start coming up with our own solutions, and the best place for that to happen is at the community, neighborhood level, not an individual, because that brings me the most fear, when an individual will be trying to fight for their own survival amongst their neighbors.
Then some of the dangerous things may come out, like guns, like crowds, instead of the sharing that we really want to see happening.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I'm glad for your learning and for your observations here. It's great to have. I met Bryn Davidson in the summer of 2006 in Vancouver as part of a day-long planning project looking at scenarios for how peak oil would affect that area of the world. It was a brilliant exercise, and I was really impressed by your simplification of the matrix of, if it's a fast decline, a slow decline, whether we really act actively, proactively, or reactively. Just that got me thinking in new ways. You use scenarios to have us think about our urban areas in a new way. Tell me about it.
Well, I think scenarios, they're really important tools in terms of opening up the dialogue, because so often a lot of people talking about peak oil or even climate change, they'll present one idea of the future that's maybe disastrous or not, but often that can be met by people as a kind of wall of, okay, I don't want to listen to this. But if you can phrase something in terms of scenarios and then lay out the assumptions behind those, people can kind of form their own minds and they can be engaged in the dialogue. And I've found that this is really a powerful way to deal with skeptical audiences, but also audiences like energy traders or other people who are coming at it from a sort of different point of view. So I think there are a number of different ways to use scenarios. So on top of using them just as a dialogue tool, though, I think they also are going to be a really important part of how we start to actually do planning. And when I look at peak oil and climate change, which are these two sort of fundamentally game-changing sort of forces that are creating a lot of uncertainty. Like, they're obviously the underlying force we understand is there, but the impacts of what's going to happen, there's a wide range of uncertainty, and this is very unusual compared to what we've experienced the last 100 years. So when I look at how we have to plan and design our cities going forward in this coming century, I think we need to use scenarios a lot more to start really testing, is this a good strategy? Is this something we should be doing? I think especially when we're looking at how we build the infrastructure and the kind of nuts and bolts of our cities. And I say that because these are the things that last a long time. Like you might get a new television, or a new computer. This technology updates very quickly. Even the fleet of cars, we could turn over the car fleet relatively quickly. But the things that we're putting in the ground and the patterns that we're creating in terms of our transportation, land use, these are things that are going to be here for the next 40, the next maybe even 100 years. And so it's really important to understand that much of the stuff that we're building today is going to be serving us, it's going to be serving our kids, it's going to be serving our grandkids in a future that's constrained by oil and constrained by whatever kind of changing climate we bring about.
So you would be having to think in your scenarios, for example, if there's a sea level rise, or if we're running out of other resources. I mean, is that part of what you put into your scenario planning?
Absolutely. So we've been looking at trying to create scenarios that combine the impacts of both peak oil and climate change. Because in some ways they can have the similar impacts. When you look at food supply, both peak oil and climate change could potentially have a negative impact on the availability of food. In other ways, they're very different from each other, and it's important to really understand the distinctions between the two. But we are looking at scenarios that look at oil price, that look at immigration, sea level rise, all these other kind of things, to try and get a good sense of if we're going to spend, billions of dollars on something, is a highway expansion maybe the best way to spend it, or could we spend it on something that pays us back in any future, as opposed to only paying us back in a future that's sort of an extrapolation of what we had experienced in the past?
Actually, that makes me think that someone here at the conference said something like, we may be at peak roads. We may have already built as many roads as we probably need for a time, and we need to be thinking about something that uses less petroleum, obviously.
Yeah, so I think in doing the scenario planning modeling that we've been looking at, we've been looking specifically at transportation, because that's what peak oil is really going to hit first. And we also see all these highway expansion projects going on. And often the reason that people are saying that we need to build these highway expansion projects is because there are these projections into the future for container traffic, for trucks, for cars, all of this stuff. And when we look at peak oil and climate change, we feel that really a lot of these are I don't know, I'd say they're delusional. Maybe that sounds a bit extreme, but I think they are like highly questionable. And so I think we need to start looking at least another model for what could happen if that growth in transport demand can't happen because there simply isn't enough fuel to run that.
It sounds to me, as you pointed out in your talk, those projections are based on an assumption that we will continue to have oil the way we have had oil. Yeah. And people are needing alternate numbers that say, well, what if we really are declining at 1 or 2 or 3 or 5% a year?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nobody to date that's really been doing this type of modeling, at least on the transportation side. Because in the past, all we had to go on was, what's happened in the past. And it's hard to get around that because there's so much inertia in all of our institutions, and, all the engineers, they go to the economists, and the economists look at what's happened. And for 60 or 100 years, that growth has been pretty consistent. And so that's a pretty, at least in their minds, compelling argument that it should keep on going. But once you've really internalized the impact of peak oil and or climate change, then you start to question these things. And so we start to look at what's the availability of fuel, and then we bundle together all of the different strategies for things that we can do. Those are alternative fuels, electrification, vehicle fuel efficiency, and we put all those together and we say, okay, this is how many trucks we think can actually run even after we've done all of these mitigation strategies. So we say, okay, in 2020, instead of being 50% up like they're claiming, it looks like it's plausible that we could be driving 10% less. And so it's not about saying, I know absolutely what's going to happen in the future, but here are 3 plausible scenarios for the future that are potentially very different from each other. And the question then is, where do we spend money today in a way that pays us back in all 3 futures? Because right now, if we invest in highway infrastructure and that transportation use doesn't actually materialize, we will have created a stranded asset. And so I think right now there is the potential that we're spending a lot of money on things that will have very little value in the future. And so when I think of all the things that need to be done, I really see this as the major place that we can shift money and everything else from something that's a stranded asset to something that is much more critical to creating a sort of resilient post-carbon economy.
Bryn, here we are on a day, this is September 22nd, in which the gas prices, the oil prices have just shot up way beyond it has for decades. Has your scenarios taken a look at things like sudden changes and shocks like that?
Yeah, well, the scenarios operate kind of at 2 levels. On one hand, we're looking at sort of long-term trends, and then the other is, okay, what happens in the short terms in terms of what types of shocks could happen and how do we respond to those. So we've actually come up with a kind of mapping system looking at a range of climate shocks and also a range of energy shocks and showing, okay, this is how it'll unfold. First these smaller shocks and then these larger ones. And we're trying to figure out how do we actually use these shocks as catalysts for proactive responses as opposed to sort of reactive ones, which can often be counterproductive. So I think there's, to an extent, the scenarios are trying to operate at 2 levels. In terms of the recent price increases, I'd say that anybody who's been involved in the peak oil dialogue hasn't been surprised by this. And I feel like if more decision makers had been involved and were reaching a higher level of, say, energy literacy, and we had a broader discussion about how some of these shocks could unfold, then we wouldn't be acting with such surprise and turmoil. So I think that's a big part of what we're going to have to do. But I think in in the long term, as we look at the energy transition, we have to understand that there's going to be two sort of bundles of solutions. One are the kind of long-term investments in sort of big changes, and the other are these sort of ad hoc, sort of quick changes that we can make. When we look at what happened to Cuba with the sort of rapid collapse of their oil supply, they had all these ad hoc strategies, and I think there's a lot that can be learned there. And I think when we look at our cities, things like carpooling and some of these other things can actually scale up very quickly, while at the same time we're doing long-term things, which is building the streetcars, changing our patterns of land use, all these other things, which will have to unfold over a longer period of time.
Great. Bryn, thank you. Thank you for bringing these kind of tools and this kind of perspective. We're going to need a lot more of it in the next decades to come. Thanks for starting it out for us.
Well, thanks for your work.
Okay.